What you think can become a habit probably can't become a habit. The greatest determinant of whether or not you're going to do a behavior regularly is whether or not the behavior is a good fit for you. I would much rather trust 10 hours of user research with the specific people that I'm building for than 50 behavioral science studies.
Jason Hreha is a behavioral scientist and serial entrepreneur who's on a mission to reshape how we think about habit building. Like me, Jason has a background in psychology and neuroscience and a track record of applying those insights to business. Recently, I got a chance to sit down with Jason, and our conversation is packed with insights that you don't want to miss. Join me and find out what really matters when it comes to building habits that stick. Welcome, Jason, to the Getting to Alpha podcast.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, it's great to be here.
And are you in Nashville right now?
I'm in Nashville, Tennessee. Exactly. Yeah.
Awesome. So you live most of your life in California, right?
Until basically 3 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're a California boy who moved to Nashville. What prompted that move?
I just thought it'd be fun. To be totally honest, I just thought it would be a fun adventure just to try something new. And there are a lot of California people here, actually. So
really?
A lot. Yeah. There was a big migration out of California to Texas, Florida, Tennessee. So a lot of California people here, but it's great. I love it here. It's a fantastic state.
What's different about Nashville, Tennessee than living in California for you?
The main thing is just the industries are very different, right? Because in San Francisco, it's all about tech all the time. In Los Angeles, there's a lot of tech too. So I lived in LA before coming here. And so out here, it's the music business is the big thing. And then there's lots of manufacturing and other fields. So it's just an entirely different set of industries and people that are working in those industries. And so that's the main thing, is that half my conversations in San Francisco were tech related. You know, a quarter of them in LA were tech related. Out here, I never have technology conversations. So it's a lot different that way.
Sounds refreshing.
It's not bad. Yeah, I like it.
So you also run a startup, Persona. Yeah. For those who aren't familiar with Persona, tell us what Persona does.
Yeah, so for most of my career, I did applied behavioral science, and I still say that I'm doing applied behavioral science just in a different way. So at Persona, we do staffing and recruiting, but we take a behavioral lens on it. So we've developed a lot of techniques for interviewing and vetting talent to try and predict how are they going to behave, how are they going to perform in different roles. So just trying to really understand people at a very deep level so that we can actually match them to the right roles so that they perform well, the clients are happy, everybody wins. So that's the whole point here. We're a remote staffing and recruiting company.
So what tools do you use to really understand those people in order to match them to the right jobs?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we've used since the very beginning psychometric tests. So these are tests that measure a person's behavioral predispositions, the way they think, et cetera. We also do a lot of different interviewing, work sample projects, and a variety of different vetting techniques. And so we try to use the entire quiver full of different techniques in order to vet candidates so that we can get a holistic picture. Especially in the early days, we really focused mostly on using psychometric tests. So that would be problem-solving assessments, personality assessments. And I know that there's a lot of controversy around personality assessments. A lot of people don't like a variety of different personality assessments, but the model that we used mostly was the Big Five, which is the most empirically validated personality model that has the best predictive validity.
Let's dig into that.
Sure.
So one of the things I love about Jason, for everyone listening, is that Jason is a highly trained, very knowledgeable, science-based behavioral designer. But Jason is also a serial entrepreneur who gets his hands dirty and gets very practical. And the Big Five is a well-known psychometric test that doesn't have a lot of controversy about it, but when it's compared to other tests, like say the Enneagram, which I'd like to touch on,
Sure,
it's much more scientifically validated. So Jason, tell us briefly, what are the Big Five traits?
Yeah.
And tell us how you use the test in your work. And practically speaking, there on the front lines, like, what does it give you? How does it make a difference when, say, there's a new person and you want to find them the perfect match for their job? How does that all work?
Yeah, it's a great question. So The big five are openness to new experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And you can also break them down into sub traits, right? So those are the big five traits. But of course, everything has a hierarchical structure to it. So you can get as detailed as you want to get. You can break the big five down into 10 traits in the middle, and then you can further break them down into 30 what are called facets. So you can get as detailed and rich as you want to get. Of course, the more traits you're measuring, the longer the test has to be. So there are some trade-offs there in order to measure those facets reliably. But those are at a high level, the big five. And what we found is very useful with the big five is that, personality tests, you sit down, you answer questions about yourself. You live with yourself every day. You're experiencing yourself and memorizing and visualizing your behavior every moment of every day. And so, of course, nobody has a better sense of you than you, right? You just know yourself better than anybody else. And if you're honest, and I would say that most people have an incentive, especially, at least we make it very clear in the interviewing context that, hey, you should be honest answering these questions because we're matching you to an opportunity and to a job for you. If you don't answer honestly, you're just hurting yourself, right? Because there's nothing worse than being put in a bad situation for you. So we give people these self-report questions. That's what personality assessments are, right? You just answer a bunch of questions about yourself, like how well does the statement describe you? And you answer questions that kind of construct or predict these different traits that I just laid out for all you guys. And from that, we can understand, okay, how open-minded and curious and into new things is this person versus being more traditional? How detail-oriented, organized, orderly is this person versus being more disorganized? How much does this person really want to work as hard as possible, grind the midnight oil versus put in as much work as required, but no more, right? So we can get this rough sense of people. And that really helps us at a high level understand, okay, great. Is this person going to be really good for this more creative role at this chaotic company? Or are they going to be good at this more traditional, organized, rigorous role at this less chaotic company? And so it really allows us to understand at a very high level a person's preferences, predispositions, and then based upon that, match them in the right role. And so I would say that personality assessment is extremely valuable and extremely helpful for just getting that rough, high level kind of picture of an individual and then using that in order to understand the types of opportunities that will be best for them in the job context. And if you explain it clearly to people and say, hey, listen, do not BS us on this, do not answer the way that you think we want you to answer, but just answer honestly, then everybody wins. They win, we can put them in the right opportunity for them. And so in that regard, we have found it to be a very useful tool.
Can you tell us a story about when you match someone based on their results where it was like, wow, that was an amazing match that I wouldn't have been able
So
to make without that test?
it's very hard for me just to pull one off the top of my head because we do so many. And just to everyone a sense of scale here, we get around 120,000 applicants a month right now. So we are dealing with about 1.5 million job candidates per year at the moment. And that's one of the reasons also why we need the help of assessments, because in order to have a recruiting org that is big enough to do resume screening or individual interviews with each person that even applies, that would be almost impossible. Because of that, we really do need, I'd say on the front line, we have certain roles that are open that we're trying to fill for clients. And then we have this huge pool of applicants that come in. And so one of the purposes of these tests is to say, okay, great, here's the roles that we need to fill that are open at the moment. Here's all the candidates. We really want to match. We want everybody to be happy. We want the client to be happy. We want the candidates to be happy. So personality wise, who in this pool really is a good fit or a good match for the open roles that we have. So that's also one of the reasons that we use these assessments is because it would otherwise be impossible for us to give everyone a fair shake if we didn't use a semi-automated tool like that, at least in the early stages of the application process. And so just in terms of just a good case study or a good example, I mean, we have good case studies or good examples almost every day at this point because we're just dealing with such high volume. We only do remote roles, right? So we are not an in-person recruiting or staffing company. We don't deal with any in-office jobs. It's all remote jobs. And because of that, a lot of people want to work from home. A lot of people have heard, oh, it would be really wonderful if I could get this work from home job. I've heard that's a great lifestyle. That's really great. But a lot of people actually are not well suited for work from home jobs. If you're hypersocial, right? If you're highly extroverted, you're probably actually not going to enjoy a work from home job just because it's actually a lot more fun to be in the office around people, et cetera. If you're kind of more extroverted, more gregarious, if you actually really crave and desire and need that small talk, social interaction, et cetera. What I would say is that the work from home personality, just based on my experience, is quite different from the traditional in office personality, and the type of person who really thrives in a work from home environment doing different roles is just, it's going to look different. They're going to look different than the way you think personality wise, or what you'd first maybe expect. If you really break it down and think about it step by step, it does make sense. But as hiring managers and as executives, I don't think we've necessarily corrected our mental picture of what we're looking for different roles for remote versus in office. I think we just assume, oh, I had a Zoom conversation or an interview with somebody. They're really charming and really great. Awesome. And I think that we just apply that same template to in office versus remote employees, when actually the person that maybe is a little bit more shy, maybe a little bit less overwhelmingly social on a Zoom, actually may be a much better fit for the role that you're looking for, even though they might not necessarily come across as well or be as charming in an interview. And so that's what I think also is so great about using standardized personality assessments, is that it gives you a different lens on individuals that you would not get if you're just looking at the resume and just talking to them. You really can see, okay, at a deeper level, what makes this person tick? What are their big drivers? What do they prefer? What do they like? What do they dislike? All these sorts of things. And you wouldn't necessarily get that just from a Zoom interview.
Right. That's
Yeah.
fascinating. You're really on the forefront of understanding what this work from home personality is with your
Yeah,
methodology. You
I would
must
say
have
so.
some interesting data.
We have a lot of very interesting data. Yeah, for sure.
Wow. So you posted a diss track. You posted on LinkedIn
It's
about
true.
the Enneagram.
Yeah,
And as many of you know, I have a psychology background as well. And so all these different personality tests are, I love them. They're familiar to me. And in interpersonal interactions, I found the Enneagram very useful.
interesting. Okay.
So I really enjoyed the Enneagram and I got a lot out of it. That doesn't mean that it would be useful for understanding how to do matching at a remote
Sure.
staffing organization, right? And I know that it's very important that the big five is scientifically validated and can be replicated and all those good things.
Yeah,
Because much of social science research cannot be replicated,
it's true.
which is, I really want to talk about, but let's put a pin in that because you're one of those people that just boom pokes a hole right in the bullshit. All right. But I'm
I try.
wondering why you kind of think the Enneagram is bullshit, or if it's just that you think it's not appropriate for some things and appropriate for others. I don't want to go too
Yeah.
far down that rabbit hole, but I really want to know what you really think.
So for me, personality assessments are useful in as much as they accurately predict your actual behavior or your future outcomes, right? That's the whole purpose of these assessments, is to understand a person well enough where you can take that information and use it to make more accurate predictions than you could otherwise. And with the Enneagram, there's just really not very much data or research showing that it's able to do that well. So that's called predictive validity, is how well does the assessment correlate or line up with real world behaviors and outcomes that you care about. And just with the Enneagram, there's just really not much there. That's not to say that once more studies are done that we won't find that it correlates very well with real world outcomes and real world behaviors that we care about. But right now, the data there is not very good. And so what I would say is it falls into the Myers-Briggs kind of bucket where, okay, it's a cool test. It can give you some insight into yourself. Maybe you can use it as a self-reflection tool. It can really help you ponder different elements of yourself in a way that you maybe hadn't thought about before. But unfortunately, just in terms of predictive validity, there doesn't seem to really be much, if anything, there. But that's the case with almost every test that exists out there. The two tests that have pretty good predictive validity for real world outcomes, the big five is number one. Then there's a test called the Hexaco, which is a six-factor model that was developed by some psychologists. I think it was in the last 20 years. It was in the early 2000s is when they came up with the model. Don't quote me on that though, but it's a six-factor model. So you have the big five, which is a five-factor model. Then the Hexaco researchers created a six-factor model that added honesty, humility as a sixth factor in addition. So I call it like a malevolent behavior kind of factor. But
Ooh.
I would argue that actually that's all just contained within agreeableness in the big five. I actually don't think you really gain all that much by pulling out these agreeableness factors into a sixth factor. So personally, the more I've looked at it and more I've played around with it, I actually don't think it really adds anything beyond the big five. I think it's just in the academic world, you have to come up with new stuff if you want to become famous and gain tenure and do well. So I think that a lot of academics just rebrand. They take old things, they reshuffle them or tweak them a little bit to create a new thing that can be their thing that they can then get tenure and all this stuff with. I mean, it's the same thing with grit, right? There's this whole idea of grit in psychology. Angela Duckworth is the researcher who wrote a book called Grit. That was her whole area of research. Conscientiousness from the big five and grit overlap almost completely from the research that I've seen. And so it's more or less just a rebranding of conscientiousness. So it doesn't really
Wow.
add a whole lot, but she created a whole career off of it and has gotten a lot of consulting contracts, et cetera. That's just kind of the game you have to play in the academic world.
Well, you know what they say, show me the incentive and I'll show you the behavior.
Yeah.
Right. So actually, this is a good moment to close up our academic conversation because I'm very eager to talk about your book and the
Okay.
techniques in there. But since we're talking about academia and the incentives in academia, one of the things you've noticed that, frankly, a lot of the world has now noticed and taking action on is the utter bullshit that underlies so much social science
Sure.
research, the messed up data, the irreproducible results, etc. Can you give us a little rant about that? Because you
Sure.
see it and you're not playing that game. You're running a successful startup with a lot of volume coming through. That's where your focus is. What's going on there with the social science academic research? And did you go through your own journey of
Oh,
really
yeah.
believing it to then realizing that you were skating on thin ice there?
Totally. Yeah. So I got out of college in 2009 and I started doing applied work almost immediately. And I noticed in like 2010, 2011, 2012 or so, at the time, my strategy more or less was to go to the academic literature. So let's say I was working with a company, a friend was building a product and they wanted to increase retention or engagement, or they wanted to increase the conversion rate on the homepage. My strategy was going to the academic literature, looking at, okay, what sorts of studies have different academics done on behavior change for, it didn't even have to be in the same area, right? Because my thinking was, okay, if you have a behavior change study about getting people to do a one-time health behavior, maybe the same psychological or behavioral principles could be applied to a business context or something like that. So I was just going to the academic literature, finding as much research as I could about one-time behavior change, recurring behavior change, habit formation, et cetera. And I would just read all these different studies, look at all the different findings, and then I'd try to apply them with the companies or with the friends I was working with. And what I noticed pretty quickly was that you'd read a study, it would talk about having some huge impact, right? Like increasing the behavior by 30% or 40% or whatever the shockingly large number was. And then I'd use these tactics and implement them in marketing campaigns or in product design changes. And I found that most of the time there'd be almost no impact. At least these first couple of years, I noticed there'd be almost no impact before I changed my strategy. And so I started getting a little bit skeptical pretty early on about the validity of these academic studies because I'd worked in two labs in college. I studied neuroscience in college, and I worked in actually a genetics lab, and then I worked in a neuroethology lab. Ethology is a branch of behavioral sciences. It's studying behavior in its natural habitat. That's the whole point of doing it. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's it in a nutshell. And doing that research, I thought a lot about is there environmental validity, right? Okay, great. You take a bunch of students, you put them in a psychology lab, at a university in front of a computer, is this environment really natural? Is the behavior actually going to generalize outside of that? And same thing with the neuroscience research we were doing. We were studying fish. That was the model organism for the neuroscience lab that I worked in. So we have fish in a tank. Great. Is this going to generalize outside of that? And so actually that lab worked very hard to create a natural environment for the fish that resembled the original environment that they came from. But so anyway, this is something I'd thought about a lot over my academic career. And so when I got into the real world, I was thinking about the same thing, and I was getting no result, no real impact from applying these different research findings to work with friends and clients. And so I got very skeptical very quickly of either I'm totally incompetent and just doing everything incorrectly, or there's an issue with the research here. And then what happened was, I think it was in 2013, there was a guy named Brian Nosek, and he created this thing called the Reproducibility Project. And the whole goal there was they're going to select 100 papers at random from 100 top behavioral science journals and then get people to try to reproduce the results. And if I remember the results correctly, it was only 36% of the papers they could actually reproduce effectively. And over half the papers, they could not reproduce the findings. And then in the years since, we've had other attempts to reproduce papers or to figure out what are the issues here with the behavioral sciences and the psychological sciences and the research involved. And my current perspective on this is that it's about 50% of the papers can be reproduced in some fashion that's somewhat satisfactory. The other half can't. So if you ever see a paper, you can flip a coin and decide whether or not you should believe it. But you can also use some common sense. There are certain areas of research that are just much more reproducible and that have a better track record than others. That's actually why I've gotten so into personality psychology and the psychometrics, because it's one of the most reproducible and reliable areas.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Wasn't there a scandal a few years back with Dan Ariely?
Yeah, I mean, there was a scandal with him, and then there was a woman from Harvard named Francesca Gino. This whole scandal got a lot of attention. It was a study with doing like an honesty pledge. The whole idea was traditionally you read the agreement and then you sign your honesty pledge at the bottom. But their whole thing is they had people do it at the top of the page. And the whole idea was that by getting people to pledge first and then report on their mileage or whatever thing that they were reporting on after that, you could increase or decrease the lying or decrease the dishonesty. But then they did the study with an insurance company, and they claimed that they got data from the insurance company that they used in order to show that actually this had a big effect. But it turns out, allegedly, according to all the investigation that was done, the auto insurance company claims that they never gave that data, I believe, to the researchers. And some data sleuths called Data Colada looked at their Excel file and saw that actually there were some manipulations that looked like they had been done to create rows in the data set in order to prove out, to make the hypothesis and what they claimed work. And so it looked like there was a bunch of data manipulation and data creation around that. And that was in this study, which was a very famous study that had gotten a lot of traction. So the behavioral sciences have not a great track record at this point. There are certain areas that, once again, I believe that psychometrics, personality psychology is quite reliable. A lot of behavioral scientists work in marketing departments at business schools. That whole area of research is just atrociously bad at being reproduced. There's a guy, Aaron Charlton. He tracks marketing study replications, and it's like a 10% or something like that reproducibility rate for marketing research, something along those lines. It's horrible. Social psychology is really bad. So most of the flashy, cool findings that you read about in pop behavioral science books come from this area called social psychology. Within that original reproducibility project data set, they found that social psychology had roughly a 25% replication rate. It's really bad. The field as a whole is not all that great. Even Daniel Kahneman, the famous behavioral economist who won the Nobel Prize, in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, chapter 4, that entire chapter is invalid because the research that he based it on has all been overturned. So it's all about priming. And so even he was pretty gullible and fell prey to this stuff.
Oh my goodness. It's
Yeah.
actually really good for folks to know about this. So
Yeah.
you don't do what Jason did, which is read it, assume it's true, put it into your product and go, hey, what
Yeah.
happened? I must have done it wrong. So I want to pull on the thread that you're weaving here about context,
Yeah.
because that's really key. You point out, which is very true. It's really good for folks to know about this so you don't make mistakes. But I think part of why you can see this and you experience it is because you're a product builder. You're a builder who ships, right? And once you go from academia to being a builder, you really see how different things are. For instance, in digital therapeutics, I know some of the folks here in this room work in digital therapeutics, and I do a lot of work there. There's so much struggle with figuring out how to take the results from the lab and the way it was done and put it into a product.
Yeah.
And I think once you have ever done science, so I studied neuroscience in
Yeah.
grad school. And I remember really clearly at my first research associate job, we were running studies. It was a MD, PhD who was in charge of it, really impressive guy. And we're running studies and I'm collecting the data and plotting the data and looking at it. And there was this really interesting scatter plot with some outliers. And the outliers seemed interesting, like they would
Hmm.
change the analysis. And my boss walks by and he looks at the chart and he's like, throw that out. And he just told me to throw out the outliers,
Well,
throw it out. And, I'm a grad student dependent on him for my job. I'm like, why? He's like, well, that's not the result that the funder wants to see.
oh,
And in that moment, I understood so much about science
yeah.
and the dynamics of science. And that's not isolated. And it doesn't mean
No.
that the scientific method isn't powerful, but it does mean that if you understand the incentive systems going on, you can be much more shrewd and insightful in the way that you look at what you want to get out of science, because we all want to get value out of that science.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's wonderfully said. And what I will say is that my experience with the behavioral sciences over the years, it's turned me much more into number one, it got me more interested in, as I said, personality psychology, because personality psychology is really all about understanding individuals, right? If you take the big five as your model, no two people actually have the same personality exactly. People can look very similar, but these are continuous variables, right? And just the probability that any two people would have the exact same measures on all these different variables, especially if you bring the subtraits into the picture, the probability is extremely low that any two individuals would have the same exact personality. Sure, maybe it'll happen a few times, but people are just so different. They're so unique. And I think that understanding individuals and really trying to understand their specific psychological differences, preferences, predispositions, and building for them is like the way to go. And that's why I've also gotten really into user research, because my whole perspective is, okay, I would much rather trust 10 hours of user research with the specific people that I'm building for than 50 behavioral science studies. I would trust my own data that I've gotten about the very unique individuals that I'm trying to impact. I trust that every day over a bunch of academic research. I think the academic research can give you a perspective that you can bring to your user research and to your iterative building process, but it should not be what you build everything on top of. Use it as a lens, use it as inspiration, use it as something that can help you interpret what you see. But at the end of the day, we're building for individuals or unique groups of people. And let's understand them as unique groups, as unique individuals, and build for them and build for what they like and what they dislike and what they're capable of, and understand their context. Let's do that versus just like, oh, I read this book and it said that scarcity or loss aversion or whatever is a really powerful motivator. Maybe. But
Depends
maybe
on the
not, maybe
context,
maybe
right?
not for this group of people, given their concerns and what you're
Yeah.
building for, et cetera. So I think that it's really all about, at the end of the day, my perspective has really shifted from here's a bunch of general psychological and behavioral principles. We can just, no matter the context, no matter the group, to let's use actually personality psychology, this understanding of the structure of human personality, individual differences, et cetera, to understand unique individuals, understand them in depth, and then build for them and try and meet them where they are. So that's how my perspective has shifted over the last 15 years or so.
That's so interesting. So, given that, you wrote a book with some general principles in it,
That is true. No,
right?
but the general principles say that actually you should personalize and actually build things for you.
Tell us three powerful ideas from your book that we can take away from this, from the book, that'll spark our interest and maybe something we could even try out.
Yeah, it's a good question. So the first big idea is that what you think can become a habit probably can't become a habit. And that's the core idea. At the center of the book is when people talk about it's the new year, people have resolutions. They say, what habits do I want to create this year? People will say things like, oh, I want to start exercising all the time. I want to create a new workout habit. Well, candidly, if you just look at the definition of a habit, if you look at how scientifically we talk about and define habits, exercise can never really be a habit because a habit is supposed to be a small, a kind of reflexive behavior that occurs with little or no conscious awareness. When was the last time you saw somebody putting on their running shoes and then going on a grueling run for 2 or 3 miles with little or no conscious awareness, right? In a reflexive manner. I've never seen that. Maybe if somebody got put into a hypnotic trance or something like that, maybe in that situation, it could be possible or something. But most behaviors that people actually struggle doing and want to do regularly, and that they buy habit books to learn how to do more often, most of those behaviors, if not all of them, cannot actually technically become habits from the neurological sense. But the problem is that the people writing these books take all the habit research that's really built for helping people form very small reflexive behaviors, and they apply it to these really hard, grueling, willpower related, goal driven behaviors, right? So, for example, reading a book, learning any new skill requires conscious effort, attention, willpower, and it's going to be hard. That's the entire reason why we need help or why we want help doing these behaviors is because they're hard and often unpleasant. Once again, if you just look at what a habit is, for example, a habit would be something along the lines of as you leave the room, flicking the light switch off. You do that with little or no conscious awareness just because it's this motor pattern that's become this reflexive little behavior. You just go as you leave the room. Or maybe if you get up in the morning and you have a glass of water next to your bed, over time you could get it so that first thing in the morning, without even thinking, you grab the glass of water and take a sip or something like that. Those are the types of behaviors that can become habits, not things like going on a run or learning a new language or writing. All these things actually, by definition, require conscious attention. They require effort. They require you to work really hard. And so, unfortunately, I think that people are being misled when it comes to habit formation, and they're being told, yeah, you can turn all these things into habits, but you can't really turn these things into habits. I think the big problem is that all of us, just using colloquial English, the definition of habit in colloquial English and the scientific definition of habit they're different, right? We use habit more freely when we talk about habits with our friends. It just means any behavior that you do with some degree of frequency, like in just casual English. But when we talk about habits in the scientific world, it means something very different. And the problem is that we're taking the scientific findings that apply to creating the scientific definition of that behavior and applying it to the general usage of the term. And so there's this misapplication occurring. But that's why people buy habit books every year, because the advice doesn't work. The advice doesn't work. And so that's the core idea of the book. And then so I say, if the traditional habit advice doesn't really work, then what does work? And my perspective is really that the greatest determinant of whether or not you're going to do a behavior regularly is whether or not the behavior is a good fit for you. So it's all about picking the right behavior, behavioral selection. People get into this habit of all my friends are meditating. I've heard that meditation is good for you and it's something that you should do. I tried it. I hated it. Oh man, well, how do I get myself to do this behavior that I hated, that I really dislike doing and that I can't do? How do I get myself to do that more? That's a common pattern people fall into. But well, why are you stuck on meditation? That's just obviously the wrong behavior for you. So let's zoom out a little bit. The whole purpose of any behavior is to achieve some outcome. That's why we evolved, right? Legs, hands, fingers, brains, et cetera, so that we could actually take goal-directed actions and do things like achieve outcomes in our life. So why am I meditating? Is it for stress relief? Is it because I want to increase my focus and attention? Is it because I want to gain status in my social group? Let me get clear about why I want to do this behavior. And then what's the outcome that I'm trying to achieve? And there are so many paths to any given outcome. So let's say I want to increase my focus and attention, but I try meditation and I hate it and I just can't get myself to do it. Instead of trying to use all these habit hacks, let me actually spend some time thinking about what are all the other activities or things that I could do in order to increase my focus. Maybe I can do brain training or something like that. Maybe I could do neurofeedback. There's so many different things that you could think of that you could do in order to get the same outcome. And you probably would like one of those more. And so the core strategy that I put forward in the book is you really have to understand yourself. And you really have to understand your outcome or the goal that you want to do. And if you try a behavior and it doesn't work, instead of trying to force it with all these hacks that will barely make a dent in you actually doing the behavior consistently, yeah, you should probably just actually go back to the drawing board and actually have a more iterative exploratory approach and actually select a better behavior for you that gets you to the goal that you want to get to. For example, with exercise, a lot of people are trying to run right now. Running clubs and all that stuff are really popular at the moment. Running is not enjoyable for most people, right? Most people are not really going to like running. A lot of people's bodies aren't well suited for running. If you have old knee issues or ankle issues or foot issues or whatever, right? It's just not a great thing. If you're significantly overweight, once again, it's going to be really hard on your joints. You're probably not going to enjoy it. But what's the goal of running? If joining a running club, maybe it's to meet people, but there's lots of ways to meet people. But if it's actually for cardiovascular fitness and stuff like that, well, there's so many different forms of cardio. You can go swimming, you can ride your bike outside, you can get an indoor bike, you can do an elliptical, you can go walking, you can go hiking, right? There's so many different ways in order to get the same outcome or the same result. And so if you're really struggling to go running, okay, well, once again, let's zoom out a little bit, figure out what's the outcome, what's the goal, what would actually be other behaviors that you could do in order to get the same thing. And I have a whole process for doing this. I have a rubric that people can follow in order to pick the right behavior for themselves that actually has a high probability of success. The book has other ideas, but I'd say that these are the two to focus on is that, okay, most of the behaviors that you're trying to make unconscious and automatic and habitual in the technical sense probably can't become that. Okay, so if that's the case, if you can't make this behavior you hate and that you find grueling, like automatic and semi-painless and unconscious, if you can't make it right like that, then actually your strategy should become picking something that you don't hate and that actually works with you in your context and all those sorts of things.
Awesome. Thank you so much for spending all this time with us, Jason.
Yeah, of course.
Really appreciate it. I think we're all going to leave this a little more inspired than we started.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me, everyone.